Going to get started so we can enjoy this hour as much as we can. So welcome to our next installment of the workshop in cultural affairs here at the Center for Cultural Affairs, and happy to see everyone. So today we have Michael Seman, who is at Colorado State University. And Michael, I met you years and years ago, I think at the PAVE Symposium at Arizona State. So it's so nice to see you again. And I've definitely been following your work because I think you have this rare, you have this rare, what's the word? You have this experience in the sector. You bring a lot of your academic work to working in the public sector with your local leaders. And I've been sort of seeing that. And then you had that awesome publication that came out with Richard Florida for the COVID pandemic. So it's so great to have met you so long ago and then to continue being in touch and seeing all that. So happy to have you today. And at that point, I'm gonna just give it over to you, and I will be keeping track of questions and excited to hear from you.
Great. Well, thank you. It's an honor to be here. I love checking in with these seminars. I've learned a lot, and it's always such a great list of speakers. So I'm very honored, and thank you to Indiana University. What I'd like to do today is take you on somewhat of a journey, what I've been doing for the last couple of years in fits and stops because of different variants and such. So I have a PowerPoint and a website. So let me start with the PowerPoint, and I think I can screen share this and see how that goes. Okay, let me get this. You'd think after all these years, I'd be better at this. There we go. And all right, does everyone see that? Okay, great. So let me just take you back to probably about the spring of 2020. I had just finished working on the Lost Art, which was the report that Richard Florida and I worked on for the Brookings Institution. And my office was kind of in crisis mode. I had many people calling me to find out what the impact would be on the arts, on music, due to COVID. And interestingly enough, one of the questions I received the most was, how many music venues do I have? How bad is this going to be? And I was like, I don't know, 20, 200, I have no idea. And that was an unfortunate situation that was brought to light, as were many structural inequities, structural problems within the entire creative economy. One of the big ones was that music venues were kind of lost. No one really knew. And before the pandemic broke out, I was minding my own business and really doing a lot of research about music venues. I'm very interested in how they operate within communities, their social, cultural, economic impacts. All that got pushed aside immediately with COVID, but then just as immediately it came back into focus. So what I want to do is talk to you about what I've been doing for the last 2 years concerning music venues, which is basically a return to my work before COVID. So in the spring, after, again, I was finished with Lost Art, the report for Brookings, NIVA was really getting together, the National Independent Venue Association, and they were rolling, and they were doing great immediate work to sort of organize venue owners, which I have many friends that own venues, and that is a tall order. It's not only are you herding cats, but you're herding very feisty cats. And it was a great thing that they were able to do, to get so many independent venues on board and lobby for one strong vision. But one question they had was, what is the economic impact of our venues? Things were happening so quickly. I was very tangential to this through my contact, Bryce Merrill at the Bohemian Foundation. And I knew they were looking at this, and they just were moving so quickly that what they did was they took a report that was commissioned for a very small part of Chicago, the Loop district where theaters were, and took that for every dollar spent, it returned $12 in impact for these theaters. And they adapted that to the number of tickets that were sold in their membership. And they came up with a value of $10 billion for all their venues. Now, again, this was a crisis situation. This was the best way to go about what they were doing in such a short period of time. But Bryce came to me and he asked me, he's like, well, is this something that you would be able to do? And my background is in economic development, economic impact studies, regional economics growth, and I did that for transportation, aerospace, culture, you name it, at the University of North Texas. And one of our projects was looking at the general aviation airports in the state of Texas, of which there are hundreds. Now, one summer, basically, I went around visiting airports. We gave out, I should say, questionnaires, trying to figure out, okay, what is their economic impact? And basically what we did was we created a classification system. We knew that how many employments were happening, how many companies and small businesses were around. And now this is general aviation, which is everything from like small jets to the occasional commercial airline, but basically not your main airport like DFW or Denver International. These are smaller airports. So we created a classification system. We had surveys. It was a long process, but what we were able to do, and we joked about it in the office, it got to the point where we could tell about what the economic impact was of any given airport, knowing where it was located and how many employments it had. So in this case, I realized that, yeah, I could adapt that concept to music venues. I would just need to know the venue revenues, visitor spending, and performer spending. Now, again, we're talking about a global pandemic. This was not something that I would be able to do in any short scope of time. But Bryce was in touch with NEVA, and they actually had this data. They collected, when they first started as an organization, they had a survey go out, and they had enormous amount of information. So before the pandemic, this kind of project would be almost impossible because, again, venue owners are very busy. They are in a precarious business situation every day. The fact that they had all of this data was just a treasure trove of information. So I said, yeah, let's try to figure out what's the economic impact, create a model of sorts for music venues. So I received NEVA's data, which they generously supplied and anonymous and very masked, but it was 707 entries. And this was the first survey they completed in June 2020. And it represented about 35% of their membership at the time. Now, after cleaning the data, I had about 269 usable entries, and this is venues large and small. But the thing was, the data points included venue capacity, employees, tickets sold, total patrons, bands played, total musicians, gross revenue, box office, food and beverage sales, performer, just a litany of information that, and I worked, studying venues in, Omaha, Flint, things like that. Never had this kind of information before. So with this is when I decided to, okay, let's go ahead and try to make some sort of economic model that it would be a paper that you could look at and point to and say, okay, this is probably what the economic impact is. Now, to do this, I had to find this classification system. It's something that you look at all the data and figure out what is the pattern. And everything in economics and nature has a pattern. It's just a matter of figuring it out. This took longer than I thought. Originally, I thought, and oddly enough, and I'm someone who was, I've played in venues for 20, 30 years, researched them. I just didn't think that the correlation between the venue revenues wouldn't be correlated to the venue size. I just automatically thought that, and I realized quickly that's not the case. The capacity of venue the amount of patrons it has, the revenues can vary wildly. If you're a 250 seat venue, you could have thousands of patrons, you could have just a few hundred patrons. It really depends. So it took a while to just be immersed in the state and figure out where is this pattern emerging. What I found was that patrons were most connected to venue revenues, regardless of how big the venue was. The other thing though, venue capacities had wide variations in numbers of patrons, but kind of like the ocean and waves, if you looked at the data long enough, you realize there were natural breakpoints that corresponded to the venue revenues. So basically, you could see a certain number of patrons related very closely to the certain amount of revenue that the venue was pulling in, regardless of the capacity. Now, within that, though, there was even natural breakpoints. So I established classifications of low, medium, high, and robust for patron activity within each venue capacity range. So for each classification within a venue capacity, so if you had a 250-seat venue and you had a medium amount of patrons, I could then group that, fill in any blanks if there were with next best comparisons, and average to get an idea of how much revenue for each capacity and how should I say, classification of patrons. So if you have a medium amount of patrons, you are a 250-seat venue, I could figure pretty closely to how much your revenues would be, and that would be the number that would be used for the economic impact input for the region. Now that was how I got about classifying venues by revenues. We also have to remember patrons, people who visit the venues. Now for this, again, I had I had the numbers of tickets sold, but I also had patrons. And this is kind of if you take one thing away from this, what I love about these presentations is it's great for if you're someone that works in the arts, but maybe not someone that does economic impact studies, but you may be that person that's asked about the data at some point in your organization. So let's talk about how music venues work in terms of tickets sold. I had a number of tickets sold. So for that, to figure out if it's spending that is local or spending from outside the region, so someone coming from the county next to you to come in, spend money, and then leave, I looked at Americans for the Arts and their assumptions for tickets sold. Now they look and think that 66% of visitors to any arts event are local, but 41% of them would travel outside of the region for that event and spend money there. So you should capture that. And I do believe that. I don't believe that all spending locally is substitution spending, meaning if you spend money on this concert, you're not going to spend money on a film. I think for many events, you would spend that money on the concert and spend that money on the film later because you really want to see that concert. Americans for the Arts subscribes to that as well. So for the local spending, it was, I figured 41% of 66% of all tickets sold. Now, in general, 34% of visitors are non-local, meaning they're coming from outside the county, spending money within your region. That's great. Again, looking at Americans for the Arts, I figured $23.44 per local visitor of spending when they have that ticket and they come to the event. And for the non-local visitor, using their total of $47.57 for spending. That's the easy part of this. Now, keep in mind, working on this, every step of the way, I was always consulting with people in the music industry. I'm very fortunate to have decades within the industry and many, 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 many friends who are pretty much sick of talking to me about this. But I was able to run these ideas by, like, does this make sense? Does this make sense? One thing that I had a problem with is I had, okay, tickets sold, but then I also had patrons. So this is something to think of whenever you're involved in these kind of situations. And I was just talking to CNN about this the other day. You have tickets sold for a music venue, and you have patrons. So patrons are people that are coming to the events. It could be a music event, but it could also be a corporate event. It could be a wedding. There are some venues that have, there was a venue in New York that I was talking to about this to get it codified, and that they had thousands of patrons more than their tickets sold. Well, it turns out they basically rent their space to a promoter who throws after parties for major concerts, and they have thousands of people come in, but those aren't tickets sold. Those are patrons. So I had to figure out how to keep track of all this. So if you are an arts organization, there's one thing to think of whenever you're doing an economic impact study. You have tickets sold, but that's not the most important thing. The most important thing with just tickets sold is drop count, meaning how many tickets are actually used. You can figure about 5 to 10% of your tickets as a music venue are people that won't show up. in the pandemic, this is a problem. When you started having variance, you would have up to 30% of your tickets, people not showing up, tickets bought, but not showing up. That is a problem when you're a music venue, because most of your revenue is coming in from drinks. And if you have food and beverage, well, 30% is a huge hit. So think about this going forward. When we have different variants, we're still not out of the woods yet in terms of music venues and profitability and sustainability. So going back to making this model, I had to figure out how to account for patrons, because they're coming to the venue, they're spending money, but not for every event. So this could, again, it could be weddings, corporate events. Someone's going to spend way more money in drinks at an after party than they would be at a corporate event. So I subtracted tickets sold from the overall patrons and then conservatively estimated spending depending on venue capacity. So for smaller venues, only a fraction of the difference was considered, and very to little non-local spending assumed for the extracurricular events. Now, the other thing is performers. You have a venue and you have people stopping in, they are definitely spending money within your region, and that's totally non-local spending. But again, I called my friends, figuring out how much or what would be a conservative estimate for spending by your performers. And again, this was amazing that I had this data of estimations of how many performers were at the venues, and that's unheard of. So for non-local performer spending, I set it at $20 per performer per event. And I believe it was $130 for a hotel for every 2 performers. Now, again, like visitor spending, there are differing dynamics of venue capacity. Smaller venues, 50 to 249 seat, you're figuring about 33% of performers non-local. Then 250 to 599 capacity, about 50% of the performers are non-local. 600 capacity on up, about 75% performers are non-local. So that was a way to kind of gauge the performer spending within town. So with all of this, I then finally had basically what was somewhat of a model, a classification system that could be used for input into InPlan, an input-output economic impact tool that is the industry standard. So, for example, if you are a 250 to 599 capacity venue, and you had a medium amount of patrons, which is about 20,000 to 39,999, your gross revenue is estimated at about $985,638 per annual. Visitor spending is about just over $500,000. Performer spending about $43,964. Again, every step of the way, I kept going back to people that own venues, performers, and to see, are these ballpark figures? In general, I was surprised at how accurate a lot of this was when looking at talking with people that own venues at differing sizes. So the next step was, okay, where are these venues? They're all over the country. So we had to figure out how could I get multipliers, meaning for every dollar spent, how much is trickling throughout the region of that venue? So I went to a mentor of mine, Dr. Terry Clower, who's the director of George Mason University Center for Regional Analysis. And we had worked together quite a bit. In fact, he was the one I worked with on the regional airport study in Texas. And we figured that, okay, we need to break it up into population sizes, which, so like less than 49,000, 50,000 to 99,999, 1 million plus, things like that, to get an idea of, what size region you're in. Because again, we're thinking at this time, well, if they're looking at a piece of paper with all this, they can figure out, well, I'm in a region this big, I have this kind of venue, this is how much impact. To figure out the multipliers for each of those population classifications, I looked at 4 regions across the country, generally northeast, southeast, southwest, northwest, a sample from each, sometimes in the Midwest as well. and figuring out, okay, what were the multipliers in general for what I was going to have the inputs for these regions. So we had 4 examples for each one of the population samples. And then we decided, what makes the most sense. And so not surprisingly, if you do this kind of work, the multipliers really weren't that different across the region. So once we had that ready to go, basically we could input all of the gross revenue, visitor spending, performer spending for each capacity for each population to find out what is the economic impact. Now, then we got to the point was, wouldn't it be cool if this could be a calculator? I could write a white paper, I could put out some sort of a booklet, but wouldn't it be really cool if, like Americans for the Arts and their arts organization impact calculator, which is online and I highly recommend it, if we could do something like that for the information we have. We had all the underlying math and data and the multipliers. Could this be a possibility? Well, originally I thought like my 17-year-old nephew could do this over 3 study halls. Like I had no idea how hard technology is to build an app or anything like that. And I quickly found that it is harder than you would think. So I reached out to many people. Either they didn't have the time or wasn't really something that they were doing, but I was working with a little bit with the Idaho Policy Institute at Boise State University, of which I think next talk is Amanda. And they do great work. And it just turned out that they had a research associate, Lance McGinnis Brown, who is ABD. If anybody's out there looking to possibly hire a policy person, he's great to work with. And he introduced me to the data visualization tool that was able to take what I had done and turn it into a static calculator of sorts. And what I'll do is, let me show that to you right now. I'll try to share my screen. Let's see, whoops. Bear with me. All right. So with Lance's help and the use of the tool Tableau, which is amazing, Lance set it up for me, and then I basically took a better part of a month backward engineering and finding out how to design and such what became what we call the music venue economic impact calculator. So let's say you are in a region that is 250,000 to 499,000, and you have a 250 seat venue. Whoops, do that again. And you have a high amount of annual patrons. So let's say you have 50,000 patrons annually. You would have an estimated $4.9 million in regional economic impact and support about 43 jobs throughout your region. So that is the culmination of everything we have worked on. Now, some notes about this, and let me. Again, this is static. The idea is that it would be, we have the underlying math. Basically, we would love to get to the point where you could put in exactly how many patrons you have, and we could give you an even more accurate estimation for economic impact. That is something that I would have to work with someone who codes, and this is kind of what I wanted to talk about. If you are, in fact, someone or someone that would be interested in working on a project like this, slide into my DMs, as the kids say. I'd love to talk to you. But when we finish this, go back to Bryce Merrill, Dr. Bryce Merrill at the Bohemian Foundation. We were in constant contact about this, and we talking about the fact that, music venues are more than just economic impacts. My work up until COVID was really looking at how they affect community development, entrepreneurship. We thought, now's the time, venues need to be a part of policy even more than they were before. And it's time to, I think city leaders, policymakers just don't know. They think venues are a place where you see music, which is a fair enough, assumption, but there's so much more. So working with Bryce, we got the Walton Family Foundation on board and the George Kaiser Family Foundation on board to look at what's the value of music venues beyond just economics, specifically in the regions of Northwest Arkansas and Tulsa, Oklahoma. Now, the first thing that they wanted to do is they merged together for this project to help with, or I should say, support the research for a very large literature review of everything that's been out there about music venues, whether it was academically or within the mainstream press. So that was my next step after just the calculator. And with that, I spent an inordinate amount of time going over just all the literature, things that I've been working with for years, but also new things. I have to give a huge shout out to Dr. Christina Balico, who teaches at Griffith University in Australia. And she's a wonderful scholar. Her work on music in cities is fantastic. She has a new edited volume out. And Australia is really, in terms of academics, is further along in this sort of study than what we are in the United States. And she pointed me in some great directions. And I encourage you to look her up and her work if you're interested in music in cities at all. But basically what I found was, what we all sort of know, music venues are more than places for live performances. They offer programming well beyond music, and including things like theater, film, the culinary arts. They incubate performers and other music ecosystem participants. They foster entrepreneurship. If you look at Flint Local 432 in Flint, Michigan, it's a wonderful entrepreneurial hub that started out as an all-ages DIY music venue. They facilitate social and professional networking. They catalyze urban redevelopment. They help brand a city, drive tourism, attract and retain an educated, skilled workforce, foster the development of social capital, both bonding and bridging, social cohesion. They foster community development. It ran the gamut. And if you're at all involved in music scenes and ecosystems, this is something that's not new, but it is new to a lot of policymakers. So it's been great to go forward on this. Now, because of the variants, this has been dragging out now from 2020 to today. Next week, I'm going to Tulsa. I did have a chance between the two variants to basically my work, I go and hang out in places I study. That's the best way that I can really gain the information I'm looking for. So I was able to go to Northwest Arkansas, and what the foundations wanted was to say, okay, here's what the literature says. Is this happening in our community? And in Northwest Arkansas, I found fascinating things. Hung out, was immersed, talked to a lot of people. Now, this is just a thumbnail sketch, and just to go over. But in terms of regional growth and education, venues definitely were a help. One venue was fantastic. It was an amenity that helped attract and retain the region's Hispanic workforce. Now, one thing you have to know about Northwest Arkansas, it's home to 3 major Fortune 500 companies. You have Walmart, Tyson Foods, and J.B. Hunt Trucking. And the venue in question, the basic gist, and again, thumbnail sketch, was that a lot of the Hispanic workforce that helped drive the growth of these Fortune 500 companies, it was an amenity that attracted this workforce. So in some ways, it was like a creative class sort of theory, but looking at it from the working class side of things, which was fascinating, and I'll probably go back to. There's another venue that hosted a successful, or several venues that a promoter used to host a successful long-running night designed for developing the social networks of African-American professionals. Because again, this region, you have this influx of talent, but it's all new, and it's a very small region. And this promoter went out of his way to say, hey, how can we connect the stream of African-American professionals? And the best way is go to a venue, create this vibe, this party, and it was very successful. Venues, of course, help attract students to University of Arkansas, but in talking with the music department, they were critical because they wanted to, the professor there that was discussing this was like, look, they can come and study with me, but I have to be competitive in that I can say, hey, here are these venues that you can also play in, whatever band or combo you develop outside of what you're learning from me. And he said, without that, it's very hard. It's also still very hard to compete with other music schools, like based somewhere like Boston, where there's many, many, many more venues. But in general, I found venues have ties with primary, secondary, and post-secondary schools offering education programming in music performance, as well as music industry. One venue has a formalized internship program with the University of Arkansas in terms of music business, where they have people come in and learn everything about that. But there's also a venue that has a great program with the local Montessori school that they'll have like an artist in residence program they support. Entrepreneurship and business development, definitely there. The venues are spaces for knowledge transfer and networking amongst the music industry professionals. They offer the opportunity for scene participants to develop entrepreneurial skills and portfolio careers. I heard that more than once. Basically, these people are learning how to promote shows, whether it's graphic design of flyers, how to identify funding opportunities, and they carry that on to other jobs. And the venues foster career development of employees as well as artists. Many employees were targeted as, well, they worked at my venue for a couple of years, but now they're a successful promoter in, city X, Y, and Z, or now they own their own venue. In terms of community development, I would need more time, but there are some things that came up. It was interesting that the venues host show varying genres, hip hop and EDM. And with that, they attract widely diverse audiences in terms of ethnicity and age. That was a fascinating discovery that I had from several different participants. One promoter is a self-described facilitator of inclusivity, and she sees shows in venues as a way to develop community specifically. That is her goal. One large outdoor venue located in the city's downtown has inspired social bonding and, to an extent, bridging. Again, I need more time to look at that. What super fascinating is one venue pivoted to being a food distribution center and created a program called Meals for Musicians during the pandemic that gave out free food to musicians. This venue was the headquarters for a festival that is a music and food festival. So they had the infrastructure. They already had freezer cases, refrigeration, and they knew how to source local food. And so they set up this program. But then they also noticed the local farmers market was having difficulties because, again, it was COVID, it was shut down. But the farmers market set up an online storefront, and the music venue offered to be the distribution point. So people could come up to the curb, get their orders directly from the venue. And an overall dynamic of social cohesion emerged from the study participants, rooted in their work within the region. They were all working for a common good. They were quick to identify how long they had lived in Northwest Arkansas. It was a very fascinating study. I'm looking to go back to this. I'm working on a book about all of this. And I have the most patient editor in the world because it's been years now. So that is basically what I've been doing the last 2 years. I do want to say I have a lot of thank yous for many patient people. Bohemian Foundation, this is all alphabetical. Bryce Merrill, from the Walton Family Foundation, Joe Randell and Laura Simmons. From George Kaiser Family Foundation, Ben Stewart. Neva, Justin Canner, Laura Wilson, Chris Zacher, and Colorado State University, Dan Goebel, my director and fearless boss, Michelle Stanley, and our dean, Ben Withers. Everybody has been super, super supportive of this. So that's what I've been doing. I will try to unshare if you have any questions.
Great. So thank you, Michael. And anybody, please feel free to put your questions in the chat or just raise your hand, and I will go ahead and moderate that way. But I usually start this off to give people a chance to think and to digest. So I do see one hand already, but I want to ask a quick question, Michael. Sure. So you talked about all these things that the music venues are doing. Well, they're fairly positive, and I'm wondering, what is it that they're doing that are possibly negative, and might we think about changes, and also what are they not doing? So the thing that keeps on coming up for me is for example, all of the pushback that we're getting on sports stadiums now, right? And what else could we be spending this money on? And I'm just wondering, like, what would you say from your perspective are some of the criticisms of how venues operate in their communities, or what they're possibly doing to the detriment of their communities and the local regions? And just a little bit of remark on that.
Sure. Well, one thing that needs to change, and they're going in the right direction, is there needs to be some sort of organizing force. NEVA is that force, but now that the crisis has passed, the question is, what's next for NEVA? Will they become more lobbying oriented? They have an enormous amount of power now. What can they do next? How will they structure? And I think that's a valid question after a global pandemic. They're still figuring things out. They all own venues, which is an incredibly precarious job to begin with, but it'll be interesting to see where they go. In terms of venues in neighborhoods, communities, I honestly don't generally see all that much negative for the side of that. The question, though, is more broadly, and we talk about this in terms of agent of change, as we all know, real estate is just, the valuations across the country are going through the roof, and that's internationally as well. So the question is, how do we preserve venues? Is it the agent of change? Do we need to have special zoning that prohibits mixed use next to a, or not mixed use, but prohibits residential for a certain, a number of feet away from a venue, things like that? Do we actively really push the agent of change so that, and fund it as well with some sort of tax situation? I know in Texas, I believe it is legislation, I think it's been passed, where you have a tax rebate. If you're your venue, you're paying your taxes, but then at the end of the year, there may be a tax rebate of some sort that could be put to differing things to improve your venue, to make it a little bit more sustainable, to work with the community, things like that.
Great, thank you, Michael. And Michael Rushton, I believe you have your hand up.
I do. Okay, well, thank you, Michael. Thank you for joining us in Indiana. I'm actually going to start with a bit of Indiana history. 100 years ago, in the early decades of the 20th century, the state of Indiana came up with the good idea of, for every sort of county seat, of which there are many in this state, they needed a performing arts venue. And so they granted money to different localities around the state to build opera houses, even though it wasn't just opera, of course. We could have concerts and speakers and everything like this. And if you go around small town Indiana now to Spencer, Mitchell, or any of these towns, you can actually see these lovely old buildings, which many towns have tried to restore. So, and I think that ties into, and the rationale ties into what you talked about in the second half of your presentation, which is what are the, as economists would say, sort of public goods and externalities arguments for having music venues. And I think these benefits were recognized a long time ago in terms of places where the community can gather, how that's very important for a lot of reasons in terms of social cohesion and rootedness, and all of the various benefits and sort of promotion and expansion of cultural horizons, sort of all of the benefits that we would normally put into that box. And if I were speaking to a public official who was saying, why should we, try to have another venue or so on, I'd probably look to those kind of arguments, because I would say there's a traditional public policy argument for why you'd want to do this. But I have real doubts about the first half of your presentation, because an economic impact study trying to calculate what spending on complementary goods tends to come with the primary spending actually doesn't give us any policy guidance at all. It doesn't tell us, for example, whether we ought to invest more or less in music venues. It doesn't say what kind of thing we should do. It doesn't even say what sector we should do, since most sectors have groups that will say, here is the economic impact of what we do, whether it be a new Buffalo Bills stadium or any new construction project that would use exactly the same methods, get exactly the same multipliers, get exactly the same kind of results. So in the second half of your presentation, I can see, yeah, there's some real policy implications here in terms of non-market goods. But the first half on the economic impact study, I still fail to see what it gets us in terms of any actual relevant information for decision making.
Sure. Well, Michael, you have to think holistically. It's not one or the other. It's everything. Politicians, it's votes, jobs, and money. So with the first half, you're looking at the economic impacts, you're looking at jobs, you're looking at money. That's a great way to get the issue in their periphery. Policymakers, you're looking at, what are the externalities? What are the positive externalities? What's the community development? So then you get to that side, and you have to navigate it. You can't just put information out there and let it go. You have to actively advocate for your position. And that's why when I'm at Colorado State, it's great because we do community engagement. It's much more important than just putting out a study or putting out an academic paper. It's getting in there with the community and finding out what are your needs and how can we advocate for that. So that's why I would go with that.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely that kind of community advocacy, certainly.
Mm-hmm.
But the economic impact study doesn't get you any of that, right?
Well, Michael,
it doesn't give you
anything
to take out in that respect, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
well,
you're more or less,
anything.
I won't accept the argument that, well, it is actually empty, but we can try to tell people it isn't, right? I mean, there has to be, we can't use that, right?
Yeah, exactly. You have to think holistically. Yeah. Are there any more questions?
Sure. Thank you, Michael. Well, we have some in the chat. So I think I'll go to David's question, which is what role might nighttime economy offices play in supporting the venues?
That's a great question. Depends how good your nighttime mayor or night mayor is. And there were some critiques about this when COVID came up. Night mayors that were really adept quickly figured out, okay, these venues need resources. How can we do this? Some were not as adept as that. One of the biggest ones was the critique that came up for New York City's night mayor, that it wasn't quick enough to address these situations. So it's a nightmare, for lack of a better term, and that's literally what they are. They will know the dynamics and nuances of how to run a music venue business-wise and what that entails and what that requires, because the business is much different than an accounting office. But it also provides an enormous amount of tax revenue if you have, say, an entertainment district. And it's different dynamics. A lot of the business goes on at night or after 5 p.m. So if they're good at what they're doing, they're very well versed in what these businesses need. And they can interface with, like Michael was just talking about, policymakers, politicians, to kind of be that middle person, to think holistically about the business. It's not just a place to see music.
Thanks. And also we have Michael's question, Feldman, in the chat, which is wondering if you had developed any data on SES levels and ethnicity of patrons and beneficiaries of music venues based on your anecdotal information about Northwest Arkansas?
That's a great question too. No, that would be the next step, is to look much more into who are the people that are benefiting from these venues. I can say that the people I talked with were widely diverse in terms of gender and ethnicity, which was super refreshing. And that gave a very interesting perspective on Northwest Arkansas's cultural scene as well. But again, this is phase one. I would love to give any information I have to other people to, if they want to look at this in their own community, by all means, let me know.
Hey, Mark, I think you have your hand up.
Cool. Thank you, Joanna. I'm afraid because I'm in Europe, I have COVID at the moment. So apologies if my voice is disgusting. So I have a couple of questions about the dashboard. One is a kind of suggestion, you were listing options, and one is a query. In terms of platforms, I want to recommend Shiny as highly as possible.
Okay.
Shiny is built on the statistical programming language, which has the crucial advantage that it is free. You know, like Tableau's great, but Tableau is very much its own ecosystem. It's expensive, like maintenance is expensive. R Shiny will get you around almost all of those problems. But my question, I know this is a bit annoying because every single time you present to a quantitative audience, this is the question that you'll get. But my question is about uncertainty. Because, you know, like with the questions that you're asking, it seemed like you were sort of trying to get more and more precision. That, you know, you have these windows and it's helpful to know if your venue sort of holds between 250, 450 people, it's going to be in this ballpark, but really we'd like to be more precise. But there's always going to be uncertainty. Like, you know, you can have two venues that are in roughly similarly sized metro areas, roughly similar number of people, roughly similar cap venue, and you'll end up with different sort of outcome variables, pending sort of various concerns that I have about how this stuff is measured in the first place. And so I'm just curious as to how you kind of deal with this, particularly when you're trying to bridge this sort of academic and sort of advocacy stuff, as you were talking about. Like, I, as a quants person, always get very jumpy when numbers look suspiciously precise. You know, when I see a number that is about 450K, I'm a bit more relaxed. When it's $453,928.16, I'm like, it probably isn't. So yeah, how do you deal with that kind of uncertainty?
Sure, absolutely. You know, again, this comes with a methodology in a paper and how to use it and things like that. It's an estimation. All economic impacts are estimated impacts. And when I'm building things, I go completely conservative to mitigate for that. Now, the preciseness, that is just a function of in-plan and the way that works. The numbers come out precisely that way if you put in, you know, precise numbers to begin with. But it's an estimation, without a doubt. So that's, you know, we're again at the first step of this. This is the first phase. So going from that, you just have to remember, again, it's an estimation.
Great. A couple more came into the chat. So Adrian, have you tracked who owns, she says, have you tracked who owns the real estate? Could economic growth negatively impact a venue that does not actually own the site?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, it surely can. Venues are businesses like any other business. Most, or I shouldn't say most, many do not own the building that they are in. Now, if you think about this though, a venue is beyond its physical structure. Very few venues, or I should say that, many iconic venues have actually moved. Like if you look at the 40 Watt Club in Athens, Georgia, that's had multiple locations, but it's still the 40 Watt Club. So there is that situation. If you are a successful venue and you move, you often will bring your crowd with you, but it's a problem. I mean, you can't get around it in any way right now, especially when you have now private equity firms investing in real estate. I mean, I could go, I have a whole lecture about that. It's very much threatening venues that do not own their own building. There is a great program through NEVA's foundational arm with a developer, and I can't think of the name of it right now, that they are helping venues that do not own their, it's very, as you can imagine, very precise and difficult. But if you're a venue that is, you know, a legit long-running venue that doesn't own your space, but you would like to, and that building could be bought, they work with the developer, kind of like a land banking almost, where they buy the venue and they work with the venue owners to have them then own it within 5 years. And it's a little bit more complex than that, but it's a great model. But it's tough. You know, real estate values, I don't see them going backwards in any enormous way for quite some time.
Yeah. And I'm sure you've seen circumstances where the, you know, real estate gets so expensive that the venue operators no longer can afford them. And I mean, there's, yeah, right, tons and tons of those. Good. So Karen, you have a question too. Are there specific policy recommendations for municipalities that you identified based on your research regarding supporting music venues?
Okay, certain policy recommendations.
Yep. So specific policy recommendations for municipalities that you identified based on your research regarding supporting music venues.
In the municipalities, not as much. Again, this is all so new that you have things like agent of change. That's policy. I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with that. But the idea that if you are a music venue and a residential structure comes in, say like in Austin, Texas, this happened quite a bit. If the residential structure comes in and people are complaining, it's on the residential structure as the agent of change in this situation for them to provide soundproofing, things like that, or pay for the venue to soundproof as well. But if a venue goes into a place that's residential, it's up to the venue to make sure that they are paying for the correct soundproofing, which is quite expensive. Things like that. Various zoning ordinances in general, that is always comes up in terms of where you can put a venue, who can have a venue, things like that. But yeah, Toronto actually has quite a bit about that in my lit review. But yeah, so that's, again, we're at the forefront of this.
I'm wondering too, going back kind of to Adrian's question, but also now, what about sort of unique partnerships that you've seen through with city and private partnerships? And wondering if that helps support the venues, because obviously we just talked about, venues going under because they can't operate, right? And I've seen, like, I know the Durham Performing Arts Center, while not necessarily a music venue, but a performing arts center, has this unique partnership for the city and I think it's PF Nederlander, so the Broadway booking agent, right? And so they have a partnership where they share the revenue, and if they don't hit a certain revenue goal, then the Nederlander is responsible for anything that. And so I'm wondering, like, have you seen those types of partnerships that might actually support any potential adverse financial impacts due to real estate, et cetera?
Yeah, there's all sorts of varying ways to do this across the country. Two that come to the top of my head is one, a lot of people don't know Red Rocks is owned by the city of Denver. And the concessions, there is a specific deal, and I don't know if Lisa Good Goddess is on the chat right now, if she's in this meeting, but she works at the City of Denver Arts and Venues, and they are funded outside of the budget. They were funded directly from the Red Rocks and their concessions and things like that. I don't know the specifics of that deal, but that's a great way for a city-owned venue that actually then supports other arts and cultural events within the city directly. There's also Flint Local 432 in Flint, Michigan, this great all ages DIY venue that I'm actually writing a chapter in my book about. They're I think the longest running DIY space in the country at 35 years now. They were, as an all ages DIY venue does, they were just getting along by volunteers, and just, Flint was unbelievably inexpensive for decades. And so they always had a space, but it got to the point near the end, and they were happenstance meeting with the C.S. Mott Foundation, then president. And he was like, hey, you guys were keeping the lights on in downtown Flint when like 80% vacancy rate at that point. You need this to redo this. You keep going with this club. Because of the owner, Joel, or the director, I should say, was kind of over it, but he loved it. But he just was, it was too much of an uphill battle at this point. And they ended up becoming a 501c3, and then started receiving some support from the C.S. Mott Foundation, a major, philanthropic organization. I think you'll see more. And now talking about the areas I'm looking at, the Walton Family Foundation, the George Kaiser Family Foundation, they are very interested in what's going on in venues. And I wouldn't be shocked if you see them actively funding in some way the venue ecosystem that they have. But that's all speculation.
Yeah, interesting. I hadn't really thought about those said partnerships with foundations. So that's an interesting idea. Yeah.
Well, we're at a point in time where there is so much money stored up in foundations that they have to spend, and they're looking for ways to do it.
So also, I guess, if there are no other questions, I do have another one. is there a sense that there might be like an optimal amount or profile of music venues in a region? So like, is there this perfect kind of environment you can think of for music venues based on density, or however you can think about it? And I'm wondering if there are any places that you might even identify that have too many music venues or too many of a certain type. And also those that might be sort of your perfectly, collaborated, organized types of regions. So I'm wondering if just through your research, have you seen any examples of that?
I've never actually looked in terms of, that's such a great applied geography question. I haven't really considered that. You can look at places that, if you look at music scenes that become successful, there's usually you can point back to a collection of venues. Seattle, Omaha, you look at the Bronx in New York with hip hop, how that happened. And, in that case, you're talking completely unofficial venues. Talking about community centers, people tapping energy from light poles, things like that, to have great throwdowns within a city park. So I would imagine you could do a study on that. It'd be great. You can look at Austin, that was thriving with I would argue, a higher concentration of venues than many other regions of the country. But then all of a sudden it kind of changed. The taste of the college students went from going out to see rock bands, things like that, to more DJ nights, things like that, over decades of time. And that was one of the problems of many that Austin, or challenges that it's facing and working with, is just the changing taste of the consumer and how they consume music.
So, and in that respect, you mentioned a little bit about the relationship between venues and the types of venues, and then honestly, the production of creativity in music, right? So like the scenes that have developed around venues and how venues are related to what types and forms of music. I mean, I don't know, just if you want to speculate a little bit more there, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And you've obviously probably seen examples of that, and we know from history too.
Yeah, absolutely. If you've read the David Byrne book, How Music Works, it's a great tome. Also, he has a great TED Talk that's sort of intertwined with that. And I've always been fascinated by his look at how music has been shaped by architecture. So you had, back in the 1800s, you had these parlors, and music was much more, it was designed that a string quartet sounded fantastic. Then you had the arena rock in the 70s, and all of a sudden you had music that was just bombastic. And then you had Miami bass in the 80s, and you had it that sounds awesome if you're in like a Nissan Sentra tricked out. Now, and I haven't done a study on this, but I'd be very curious, is the rise of EDM, does that at all have a connection with the fact that it's really expensive for rehearsal spaces, places to live in cities like New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles? Is that shaping the music? Is that why we're having, now we have this technology, is it the technology? Is it the architecture? Why is electronic music and EDM like really taken off? Why is that? Is it the culture? This was born out of the alternative lifestyle culture that is now much more prevalent within major American cities. I think there's no one easy answer, and I would love for someone to do a study on that, because I do think there's connections we don't see. Again, there's patterns in economics and nature, always. It's just a matter of taking the time to be the data and figure it out.
Great. Thank you, Michael, for that insightful answer. So that brings us to the end, and I just want to say thank you to Dr. Michael Seman for your presentation. And
thank you. Thank you for having me.
We were all in the same room and we would hear it. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. And we are near the end of our series, but please do join us again in a